Have you ever had a day when you are just going through the day and you're like, I don't even know what is going on. It feels like the world is falling apart. You ever have a day like that? Anybody been there? Anybody have one of those? I'll tell you, I had one of those this week. My family and I, we were on vacation last week, so Monday was my first day back in the office. And if you've ever been gone and you come back and you step back in, you're like, oh my gosh, there's so much going on. And so the workday was already long and hard. Then late in the afternoon, I get a text message from my wife, and the text message is, there's no water at the house. Now, we have 6 people living in our house, which means there's no showers, there's no toilets, and I have a bunch of teenage boys, so that is a problem. And so I got the SOS text, and I'm like, all right, jump in my car. I head home as quick as I can. And here we're working on the well. We're trying to figure out what's going on with the pump, trying to get the water back to the house. And I look over on the hill, and the hill is on fire. Now the hill is close. The hill is close enough that I could throw a baseball to and hit. I know some of you have seen me throw a baseball, so maybe not that accurate. Maybe that hill was close enough that I could hit a golf ball, and I could hit it with a golf ball. And I know some of you have seen me play golf. You know I can't hit a golf ball very far. Let me just say that hill was close. That fire was coming, and I was like, what is going on? And then we're looking at this fire, and the fire's moving along some of you, and my brother and sister-in-law, I've been building a coffee shop, and I'm like, this fire is approaching their coffee shop. And my brother and sister-in-law, they're out of town. So my nephew is at the coffee shop, and I'm like, man, I feel like I need to go help him. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. So we run down to the coffee shop, and we're trying to turn sprinklers on, because what else do you do? And we look up the road, and there's just this smoke coming over. And it was kind of this, I don't know, what ominous feeling. It was like, holy moly, what is going on? I mean, I felt like everything was falling apart. That's how I felt. Now, the fire was contained. We were able to get the pump working again. But I will admit, like that night, I was just like, holy moly, what is going on? I felt attacked on many different sides. Many of you have been in that situation where you have those days when you just feel like everything is falling apart. But it's not just fires. It's not just fires and wells that fall apart. I mean, we live in a country that sometimes it feels like our country is falling apart. In fact, just this past couple of weeks, we've been thinking about this shooting that happened at the Trump rally. And you know, the biggest thing for me is not just the shooting. The biggest thing for me is after that happened, you hear all of this animosity. You hear people have different spins. You hear the talking heads. They're all name calling. They're doubting things. And I'm just like, this is not a good situation. Like, I love our country, but this whole election season reminds us that politics is so discouraging. Our country is so stinking divided. And I don't care which side of the aisle you sit on, we just have so much animosity, and it just brings out these attitudes where, hey, the way I vote is right, the way you vote is wrong, and therefore we're enemies. And this is just exhausting. It's discouraging. And I look at our country and I'm like, man, is this what America is about, picking sides? Man, there's this heavy stuff all around us. I mean, there's the stuff in our country. There's fires all around us. There are wells that have to have work on them. But we also would recognize there's also some personal stuff that we deal with. Many of us in this room have personal issues that we are just overwhelmed with. Some of us have anxiety because our kids are going to be moving away. And that's a hard thing as a parent. Kids being gone. Some of us are looking at our adult kids making decisions for themselves, and you're like, man, dumb kids, just do what I tell you to do. Don't do what you want to do. But as adult kids, you don't have the chance to tell them what. You can't send them to the room anymore. They get to make their own decisions. And that's hard. Some of us are struggling financially. Some of us are realizing, hey, our workplace is kind of difficult. My job is difficult. Some of us have broken relationships, strained relationships. This past week, I met with a family that the father of the family, the patriarch, has died. The family is grieving over this loss. And then I think about me and just like kind of where I'm at in my situation, right? Like I've got hopes and dreams for my kids, and I've got fears for their upcoming seasons. We've got 3 out of our 5 kids are now adults, and that scares me because the decisions they make have a lot more significance. It's a lot easier when I could just send them to their bedroom. We have 2 kids in high school, which means in a couple years, it's just me and my wife. And I'm kind of like, I hope she still likes me because she's going to have just me here in a couple years. I hope she still likes me. Like these are some of the fears and things that are weighing me down right now as we get ready to send Hudson off to college. And can I be honest with another struggle, personal struggle for me? I got hair that keeps growing out of my ears. It's terrible. Like I trim these things like twice a week, and they just keep growing bigger and bigger and fuller. And then there was one morning I woke up and I'm like, man, I've got an eyelash in my eye. So I go in front of the mirror. It's not an eyelash, it's an eyebrow. It grew 3 inches overnight. And I'm like, what is going on? Like, you young people, like I think Alec and Adam, like enjoy being young because, man, when you get old, it's kind of like you lose the hair up here and it grows everywhere else, right? Some of you, I've seen it. It's happened for a long time. Getting old is terrible, right? It's just terrible. Now listen, here's the question, though. All these problems we deal with as Christians, how do we handle the difficulties that we face? All these difficulties around us, personal, in our country, how do we handle those difficulties? Some of us, what we do is we ignore the problem, right? We just pretend it's not there. We minimize it. We just think, you know what? I just got to get through it. I got to get over it. Or we tell ourselves, well, come on, it could be worse. You know, your thing is hard, but, you know, it could be worse. So just don't make a big deal about it. But when you're going through those difficulty things, does that ever make it better? Some of us, we go through that difficult thing and we just think, man, I need to power through it, right? I'm just going to grit my teeth. I'm going to read a self-help book. I'm going to try a little bit harder. I'm going to get the white knuckles and I'm just push through the problem. We might be capable to fix some things, but there's some things, if we're going to acknowledge, we can't make it better. We can't fix everything, no matter how capable and how hard we try. And some of us, when we face these difficulties, some of us aren't going to minimize it. Some of us, we're not going to just plow through it. Some of us are going to be crushed beneath those difficulties. We face whatever it is, and we're like, I can't handle this. And we freeze. And we seclude ourselves. And we try and numb the pain with food or alcohol or social media or any other thing. That way we don't have to feel it, and we can just allow it to crush us. Now, as Christians, how does God want us to handle the difficulties that we face? The weights, the burdens, the things that weigh us down. We've been studying the book of Micah here now for 2 months now, and it's been great. This is one of the minor prophets, and I will admit, when I first started studying the book of Micah, I was like, this is a difficult book. It's full of judgment and prophecy, but as we've studied it the past couple of weeks, I will tell you how much I've loved it, because we get a picture of who our God is. He is amazing. He is remarkable. Today, we start chapter 7, which is the last chapter of Micah. Micah has spent 6 weeks preaching to the people, warning them about the incoming judgment that God was going to bring on them, as well as reminding them of the promises of God. Hey, there's going to be this judgment, but don't worry, God's going to get you through this. It's remarkable. And chapter 7 is a little bit of a transition. Instead of Micah preaching to the people, chapter 7 is more of a personal response from Micah. He is personally processing what he's seeing in his country, and he's discouraged. He's looking around the nation of Israel, and he feels like, man, everything's falling apart. The nation has abandoned God. The family unit is in decay. Leaders are failing to provide justice and mercy. He's looking and he's just overwhelmed with the difficulty that he sees. And how is Micah going to handle those difficulties and those disappointments? Well, we're going to see in our text today, Micah shows us that God welcomes our honest assessment of our circumstances. He welcomes our lament. He welcomes our burdens, us unburdening ourselves on him. Yet he also models us that while we can be real with God with our burdens, we still need to learn to look to God, to wait on God, and to trust God in the middle of whatever disappointment and difficulty that we're in. In fact, these verses we're studying today are going to be a pattern for us to follow on how we handle our own difficulties. And as we jump into this text, before we do that, I want to ask you to do something for me. I want to ask you, every one of you, what is your biggest burden right now? What is your biggest difficulty? What is that anxious thought that is in the back of your mind as you're trying to lay down to go to sleep at night that keeps you up? What is that for you? Can you name it? Will you name it? Put a name on it. Your marriage, your kids, your job, your finances, your health. I want everyone in here to say, this is what it is for me. And I want you just to sit on that for a minute and hold it in the back of your mind. And we're going to come back to that at the end of our message. So Micah chapter 7, starting in verse 1, he starts out and he says, woe is me. This is a cry of disappointment. This is a cry of hopelessness. This is Micah saying, man, this is a horrible situation. This stinks. This stinks. When we hear someone say, woe is me, like my first thought when I hear that is I think, man, this person's pretty selfish, right? They're like, oh, poor me. Oh, poor me. No one complimented my cute outfit. Nobody said you look really good today. Poor me. Now, when I hear someone say, woe is me, I think they're like, well, only 3 people liked my Instagram post. What's up? Poor me. Like I hear this and I hear this selfishness of like, well, nobody listens to me. Nobody loves me. But in Scripture, when we see woe is me, this is one of the most powerful and deeply felt phrases that we can read. This is a lament. Lament simply means an expression of grief or sorrow. It is to mourn or to grieve. In fact, we would say to lament is to sum up the feeling of a parent who has lost a child. It would sum up the feeling of a widow at a spouse's funeral. It would sum up the feeling of someone in a country whose country has been conquered, right? Woe is me is only used in the most dire and grim and difficult circumstances. And this is what Micah is saying, woe is me. I'm lamenting. The question is, what is he lamenting about? I'm glad you asked that because there's 3 things I'm going to tell you that he's lamenting about. Number 1, he's lamenting over the disappearance of the righteous people. Here's what he said in verse 1. He said, woe is me, for I have become as when summer fruit is gathered, when no grapes are gleaned, and there are no clusters to eat, no first ripe fig that my soul desires. Micah is using a farming analogy for us, a farming metaphor. Kind of this picture of a farmer who has worked hard, they've cultivated their field, they've labored faithfully working on the farm. And then they get ready to harvest it, and the fruit of the labor is vanished. This is how Micah feels. Micah has been preaching for years, for decades. He's warned people about judgment. He's called them, hey, put your faith in God, put your trust in God. And he looks around, and what does he see? Nobody's walking with God. Nobody is trusting wholly, heartfully on God. They're trusting in themselves and these other things. And Micah looks and he says, man, this stinks. Verse 2, it says, the godly have perished from the earth. There is not one who is upright among mankind. They all lie in wait for blood. Each hunts each other with a net. Micah is saying the people when they no longer pursue godly desires, the people actually begin to prey on one another. Again, we're called to love one another, but when we quit pursuing the things of God, instead of loving one another, we use one another. And Micah's looking and saying, this is what I see in my nation. People aren't loving each other. They're using one another. They're prey. They're taking advantage of one another. And here Micah is lamenting over the loss of the righteous people. And this is not just because his ministry appears to be fruitless. He's lamenting because people have abandoned God. You see, when a group of people align themselves up to the things of God, when a group of people aligns themselves up to God's desires, do you know that community begins to thrive? Like, you don't have to be a Christian to see this. Like, we understand the kingdom of God, God's kingdom is other-centered. It is about us sacrificing ourselves for the good of other people, where we are sacrificial and gracious. And when people actually live those things out, do you know the world around us sees it? When people are loving others rather than hating them, when people are willing to serve others rather than themselves, when people are willing to sacrifice their resources for the common good, communities thrive. And Micah's looking around and saying, no longer is this community thriving. No longer are the people living according to the standards of God. He's lamenting the loss of the godly people. And what happens is when people no longer pursue the things of God, there's a couple other results that come from that. The two other things that he's lamenting. The second thing he's lamenting is the corruption of leadership. He says in verse 3, their hands are on what they evil. Their hands are on what is evil, and they do it well. The prince and the judge, they ask for a bribe. A great man utters his evil desire in his soul. Those they have weave it together. The best of them are like a briar. Most upright of them are like a thorn hedge. Micah has talked a lot in his book about how God desires and values justice and mercy. These are things that should be evident in Christians' lives, and especially in leaders. God holds leaders especially responsible to promoting this justice and this mercy. And as Micah looks onto the leaders in his nation, he can't help but lament. Because the leaders are crooked. The leaders are not promoting justice. They're not promoting mercy. No, he says the princes, the judges, the great men, which would be community leaders. No, they're motivated by bribes. They're led by their evil desires rather than the good of the community. And he laments over this. And this is good and right because leadership is significant. In fact, probably one of my greatest fears as a leader is that through my leadership, I would turn people away from the truth and grace of the gospel. Leadership matters. It's a high calling. And Micah's looking around the nation and he's lamenting because the leaders have lost it. They've lost it. So he's lamenting the loss of the godly people. He's lamenting the corruption of the leaders. And thirdly, he's lamenting the complete social unraveling. That's what he says in verse 5. Put not your trust in your neighbor. Have no confidence in a friend. Guard the doors of your mouth with her who lies in your arms. For a son treats his father with contempt, and a daughter rises against mother. A daughter-in-law rises against mother-in-law. A man's enemies are in his own house. He is lamenting literally the complete social unraveling of the world around them. This is the tearing of the fabric of society when no longer can you trust your neighbor. No longer are friends worthy of your confidence. He says no longer can you trust your family. You can't even trust your family. Spouses are emotionally estranged. Sons are fighting against fathers. Daughters against mothers. And we know everybody is against their in-laws, right? I mean, that's what's happening in this society. And this is what happens when people no longer pursue the things of God, no longer have a heart for God's desires. This is what begins to happen. When righteousness and the things of God are no longer a concern, every person becomes motivated by themselves. And at this point, Micah says, I'm looking around, and our society is unraveling. And he's lamenting. He's grieving over this. I want you to notice that this lament is not whining. It's not complaining. It's not grumbling. No, we've said that lament is to mourn. It's to grieve. Lament is to take an honest assessment of what we're seeing and pour out our sorrow to God. This is what Micah is. He's taking an honest assessment. Man, the righteous people are gone. The leaders are corrupt. Our society is falling apart. He's assessing it, and now he's taking this and grieving this and giving this to God. You see, sometimes in Christian circles, I'm not sure where it came from, but there's this idea that some wrongly think that Christians, man, we shouldn't suffer. As Christians, if you're following God, you shouldn't suffer. You should just have everything good for you, right? And so what happens is if we believe that, then when hard things happen, we minimize those hard things. We try and pretend they don't exist. Because if there are hard things in my life, then that's evidence that I'm not walking with God the way that I should. Because if there are difficult things happening around me, then maybe that shows I have a lack of faith in God. In fact, I met with a lady this week who came into the church, and she was in tears and just broken. She said, I know, like, I've been a Christian. I've been following God for a long time. And I know, like, I'm supposed to have it all together, but I'm struggling financially, and here's why, and here's my situation. And I'm so embarrassed, and I feel like, why? And I'm like, no. Like, who said we're supposed to have it all together? As Christians, we value progress, not perfection. God doesn't call us to be perfect. He calls us to take steps to become more like him. God knows that we live in a fallen world, which is why he sent Jesus to begin to redeem it. And so as we go through life, we're going to have those difficulties. We're going to have the fires that come down on us. We're going to have the wells that have to get worked on. We're going to have difficult relationships. We're going to have financial hardships. These things are real. And listen, when you face those hardships, God welcomes your lament. In fact, lament is all throughout Scripture. 60 out of the book of Psalms, there's 150 Psalms, 60 of them are lament. You know that means 40% of the Psalms deal with grieving and struggling and problems. Jeremiah was known as the weeping prophet. In fact, did you know there's a book in the Bible all about lament called Lamentations? God is not afraid of your lament. Lament is where we can be honest with our human experience, where we don't settle on a superficial, shallow way of looking at life as if any difficulty is just an illusion. We're going to minimize it. No, the Bible deals with real life. It doesn't ignore the brokenness of our world. Lament shows that God draws near the brokenhearted to bring redemption to those broken things. And Micah begins this, and he laments. But what happens next is just significant. Verse 7. Verse 7 says, but as for me, I will look to the Lord. I will wait for God of my salvation. My God will hear me. You see, when we lament, when we bring our hardships to God, this is not a lack of faith. Lament is not an absence of hope. Lament is when we take our difficulty to God. Micah is not ignoring his difficulty. He's not wallowing in pity. No, he actually takes those things to God in the midst of his grief. He takes those things to God, and he's going to preach to himself. He's going to tell him 3 things you got to do. Listen, Micah's got this difficulty, this burden. He takes it to God, and he tells himself to do 3 things. Number 1, he says, you are to look to the Lord. You are to look to God. Number 2, you are to wait on God. And number 3, you are to trust in him. How much greater do you think our lives would be if we did those 3 simple things? When we face whatever it is, if we look towards him, if we waited on him, and if we trusted, how much greater would our lives be? In fact, next couple of verses, he's going to recount the promises of God, as remind himself as to why he can trust him. He says, even though I've fallen, I'm going to stand. Though I sit in darkness, God will be my light. Even though he and the people have sinned, they're enduring God's fury. He says God will champion their cause and establish justice. While their enemies triumph and doubt God's existence, God will put them to shame. God will trample them like mud on the streets. Micah is trying to preach to himself. He's saying, yes, there's this difficulty, there's this hardship, but listen, I can still look to God. I can still wait on God. I can still put my trust and my hope in him. In fact, if you were to say, what's the summary of this message? What's this message all about? Here's our big idea today. God welcomes our honest lament of our difficulties. He's not afraid of it. He welcomes us to pour out our heart to him. Yet he also instructs us to look to him, to wait on him, and to trust in him. God welcomes it. God welcomes us our bringing our difficulty to him. In the middle of that, he's going to call us to look to him, to wait on him, and trust him. Now, can I be honest here for a moment? That sounds really good, but do you know how challenging that is? Do you know how challenging that is? Because everything about that goes against human nature. At least my human nature. Maybe your nature is different, is better than me. But you know, when difficulties arise, you know what my natural inclination is? When difficulties arise, I strategize. When I've got a problem, a burden in front of me, I'm going to figure it out. I'm smart enough. I'm going to go try this. I'm going to try that. I mean, like, we're Americans. We pull ourselves by the bootstraps and we just figure it out, right? No, I don't need to go to God. I just need to solve it on my own. Some of you are different. Some of you become despondent. You face that difficulty, and rather than going to God, you just become despondent. Poor me. I'm a victim. This is terrible. It's an injustice. Some of you face a difficulty and you become bitter. You become a bitter person. And this is why this is so challenging to me. Because again, my instinct is not to go to God first. But Micah and the whole Bible teaches us this. That the first response of Christians in hardship, when we face the broken world all around us, our first response should not be to strategize how to fix it. Our first response should not be despair. There's no hope. Our first response should simply be going to God in prayer. That should be our first response. So many of us, when problems arise, what's our first response? Strategy. Here's how we're going to fix this. Here's how we're going to get through it. We face a problem. Who do I need to call? I need to call my friend and get advice from them. I need to call and do this or that. And why do we do those things? Because we're not looking to God. We're not waiting on God. We're not trusting in God. Who are we looking to? We're looking towards ourselves. We're waiting on ourselves. We're trusting in ourselves, which is why what Micah is saying is so powerful, yet so challenging. It's so simple, but so difficult. Because if we're going to be honest, we look to ourselves. We trust ourselves. And Micah is saying, rather than doing that, when you face that hardship, go to God first and foremost. Can I tell you how challenging this is for me as a pastor? Because I'll tell you what happens People says, hey, you're a pastor, can I talk to you? And they share their burden with me. They share their difficulty. You're a pastor. And I feel like I almost have to validate my role as pastor. And I'm like, well, I better give you some good advice. Man, let me tell you, here's how you get out of this situation. Here's how you fix what you're in. And I'm challenged because my first language, my first response should not be advice. My first response should be not strategy, not advice, not despair. My first response should be prayer, talking to God, laying these things out before him. And as we pray, we remind ourselves, no, we're not looking towards ourselves, we're looking to him. We're not waiting on ourselves, we're waiting on him. We're not trusting in ourselves, we're trusting in him. Now let me clarify, for us to do that does not mean we don't do anything. This is not an excuse for us to be lazy and expect God to spoon feed us. But I think this text should be a challenge to every one of us in this room of who are you looking to? Who are you waiting on? Who are you trusting on? Now, normally we come to this point of the message and we go to application, where I say, hey, this is what God's word says, and here's what you need to do this week to live it out. Here's how you practice it. Today we're going to do a little different. I'm not going to tell you what to do this week. You know what we're going to do? We're going to do what Micah just told us to do. Earlier I asked you, what's your burden? What's that difficulty on your shoulders? Did you name it? See, what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to stop strategizing about it. I'm going to ask you to stop worrying about it. I'm going to ask you to stop being in despair about it. I'm going to ask you to stop hoping that your pastor is going to tell you what to do. What I'm going to ask you to do, would you pray? Would you stop right now and pray? And maybe for some of us, maybe like Micah, we need to lament. We need to just grieve before God. Maybe that means you need to yell at God. Maybe that means you need to cry. Maybe whatever it is, we need to pray and take it to God. Now, I know what happens is we're in the church and we're like, man, but if I pray like that, what are people going to think about me? Can I just, at least for me, I'm done worrying about what other people think about me. Here at Restoration Church, we talk about this all the time. We talk about progress rather than perfection. God doesn't expect us to be perfect. Because the moment God expects us to be perfect, you don't have a pastor anymore. You don't find progress when you're afraid to acknowledge that you are still a work in progress. Every one of us are a work in progress. Which means we all have those things that we need to be coming before the Lord. I already talked about my burden. I feel the weight for my kids. I feel the weight for this VBS. Because there are a ton of kids signed up for this thing. And I feel the weight of success. I feel the weight on this being a good representation of our church. And I've spent the last week and a half worrying and strategizing and feeling overwhelmed. And I need to just come to the Lord today. As my invitation to you today is, in your seat, would you pray? Would you take this time and close your eyes? Pray for that burden, that anxiety. Just let it be known to God. And as you pray, preach to yourself to look to Him, to wait on Him, and to trust in Him.